Okay, welcome, and thank you all for joining us on this very important event. My name is Rose Creighton. I am the chairperson of the Anti-Racism Action Group of the Community Church of New York, Unitarian Universalist. The community church is well known for its struggle against racism and for social justice and human rights. This committee is part of that continued struggle. The other members of the committee are Faye Bennett Lloyd, Janet Koplos, Patty Paris, Ellen Rader, Marianne Rancoli, David Strawn, and Esther Rosado, ex officio member and director of adult religious education. This forum is part of a series, The Realities of Racism. I need not tell you that we are an extremely divided nation, and that if we don't find a way to come together and respect one another as equal human beings, we are doomed. There is no more important discussion than the one we are having today. Racism, white supremacy, though not new, has proliferated with the advent of the former president. What was to be a true democracy will not come into existence under these circumstances. Autocracy and fascism will take its place. This afternoon, we will be looking for ways to combat this horrible prospect. In addition to what we are discussing today, the group has been examining such topics as, is there any such thing as racism? How the idea of race is used politically and socially by a powerful minority to divide and control the majority of us, no matter how we define ourselves. Our speaker for this afternoon will speak on the topic, Overcoming the Divide, Building a Just Society. And I will ask Marianne to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Rose. Our speaker today, Ellis Cose, holds a BA degree in psychology from the University of Illinois and a master's degree in science, technology, and public policy from George Washington University. He is a prolific author, independent radio producer, popular lecturer, and public speaker. He is the author of 13 books on issues of national and international concern, including the best-selling The Rage of a Privileged Class, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, and Democracy, If We Can Keep It, the ACLU's 100-Year Fight for Rights in America. His newest book, Race and Reckoning, From Founding Fathers to Today's Disruptors, was published in July of 2022. The paperback is due out this summer. He has created, produced, and hosted Against the Odds, a pilot radio series set in Kenya and the United States, which aired in 2008 in more than 100 radio markets, including 8 stations in the top 11 markets in the United States. He followed that up with a 4-part series in 2009, featuring stories from Rwanda, Kenya, India, and the United States, which also aired in top radio markets across the states. He has appeared on a range of national and international news programs, including Dateline, ABC News, and Good Morning America. Mr. Cose is also the founder and director of Renewing American Democracy, an organization that, in collaboration with Long Island University, the University of Southern California, and Northwestern University, is attempting to elevate and deepen the discussion about democracy in America and engage young people in the democracy debate through town halls, democracy dialogues, essay contests, lectures, and listening tour. Ellis Cose lives in New York City with his wife and daughter. Thank you, Ellis Cose.
Well, thank you, Rose, and thank you, Marian. I must say, you've picked a really slow news week to talk about this topic.
Really?
But more seriously, obviously, we're dealing with something unprecedented in this country right now. We have, for the first time, had a president indicted on federal charges, and more are coming. He's also been indicted, as you know, on state charges, and more of those are coming. We are in a very interesting state as a society. We are very fluid. We are very in a very weird and unsettled place. And that unfortunately is going to last for a while as we see how these trials come out. And there's also a certainty already, as we know, that this is not just going to be a series of trials. They're going to be a series of attacks on the American democratic system, on our justice system, and an attempt to figure out what we stand for as a country. So that's one of the things that happened on this very slow news week. Another thing that happened this week is that the Supreme Court upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in an Alabama case where the state had was essentially attempting to diminish the impact of the Black vote by the way they constructed voting districts there. It was a 5-4 vote. Two conservatives, Roberts and Kavanaugh, joined with the 3 liberals to basically say maybe it's not quite yet time to abandon one person, one vote. Maybe it's not quite yet time to abandon the very idea that votes should be counted equally and that we should all have equal access to the ballot. So for those of us who believe that the United States has become way too undemocratic, that was at least one sign of something auspicious and good happening in a venue that was, quite frankly, by many of us unexpected, given the way this Supreme Court has been ruling. The assumption of most folks, I think, who watched the court had been that that decision would go the other way. And the third thing that I would note of interest that happened this week was that California's task force to study and develop reparation proposals came out with a huge report, and where they wrestled with how to deal with the impact of historical inequalities and of slavery itself on Black Americans who are currently wrestling with survival and existence. And it was an interesting report for lots of reasons. I mean, it looked at everything from lifetime earnings to life expectancy to missing wealth, from lack of home ownership, which in one way or another are traceable to our history, as a state, as a country that embrace enslavement. And they came up with a number of figures, some of them which are sort of eye-popping, of theoretically potential payments of up to, I think, 1.2 million for descendants of slaves, which is interesting. I mean, this is a discussion that actually began, as far as I counted, in 1969, when the National Black Economic Conference, then headed by James Forman, came up with what they called a Black Manifesto, and they wanted between 500 million and 3 billion in reparations. Is this money ever going to be paid? Is anything going to ever result from this? Who knows? I'd be shocked if any descendants end up getting $1.2 million. But it's an interesting and important discussion. And it's a discussion that in some ways is dictated by our history, and in some ways is dictated by the moment that we find ourselves in now, in my opinion, when there is a war on wokeness, to use the words of one of the leading presidential candidates on the Republican side. But it's also a war in history. It's a war in the teaching of history. It's a war on anything that challenges the status quo. And it's driven by many things. It's driven by the gender movement. It's driven by growing economic inequality. And it's driven, perhaps more than anything, by race. And the war on Black history is a war on the very idea of reparations. It's a war on the very idea that historical wrongs can somehow be understood and addressed and have any relevance to the current day. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about history, because I think history is very relevant to where we are today, and because I think that in many ways we are not only creatures of our history, but prisoners of our history. In Race and Reckoning, which I'll read a little bit from a little bit later, I argue that race-based slavery was not inevitable. In 1619, when two ships with Africans arrived in Jamestown, it was not quite clear what was going to happen to them. Some ended up clearly as slaves, some ended up not. There's a fellow most likely from Angola, who was called Antonio, who eventually became known as Anthony Johnson, who served as an indentured servant for a while in Virginia. After getting his freedom, he acquired servants of his own, and several of them, actually, one of whom went to court after serving for a period of time to secure his freedom. The man, who figured that he had served, whose name was John, figured he had served long enough, as a servant, and was granted his freedom by the court. And this is a decision that Anthony, or Antonio, after wrestling with for a while, decided to appeal. And in effect, he went to court again, and in 1655 got a decision where the man who had sought his freedom was ordered to become a servant for life. So we have this interesting incident in which a Black man became one of the first slave owners in America, because in being basically sentenced to serve him for life, he was being sentenced, obviously, to slavery. In that era, in the early to middle 1600s, there was a period where we could have, as a nation, decided to reject the idea of race-based slavery. It was the time of indentured servitude. There was a time when whites were being brought from London, from Ireland, from elsewhere, and got the same deal that Antonio got, which is they served for a period of time. And then if they were lucky, they were granted some resources and some land, and they could, sort of make their own way in America. But we didn't go that way. We didn't go that way for lots of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, was that the indentured servants trade was fading. There was a need for manpower. Unlike the indentured servants who had relatives and friends, often in Europe and in America, and who could either disappear into the population or appeal to their relatives and friends, the Blacks from Africa did not have that for the most part. And so it was much easier to enslave them. And we also had a rising philosophy of, defining races and essentially establishing racism. So laws were changing, attitudes were hardening. And in 1669, for instance, the Virginia legislature removed all penalties for killing enslaved people resisting authority. That was even toughened in the early 1700s, where they removed all penalties for killing Blacks for correction. So by the time that the Declaration of Independence was authored and signed and issued, and by the writing of the Constitution more than a decade after that, slavery was entrenched. And the only real question was about its spread and how it will be dispersed in our society. And that reality, led us to become, in many ways, the country that we became. And even though the question was settled in a sense, it was settled that we would be a country that was, part slave, part free, that we would have this race-based institution. The country was never as a whole really comfortable with that. And so we wrestled with that throughout the decades. And in the 1800s, because we had opportunities to acquire new land, the questions were revisited again. Just as a historical point I will make, Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. The Battle of the Alamo was fought in 1836. What we are generally sort of taught, in our history books and whatnot, is that the Battle of Alamo was all about freedom. It was about freedom from Mexican suppression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some truth to that. But it was also fought over slavery. Because as I said, Mexico had abolished slavery. At that point, Texas, not theoretically, Texas was part of Mexico. It was the Mexicans did not favor having a slave territory. And of course, the white settlers who wanted their cotton crops were resisting that. So in the last 100 years, or actually last couple of 100 years, almost, the war or the battle for the Alamo has become something that it really wasn't. It has become something that was all about virtue and values. And as I say, to some extent, you can argue that it was, but it was also about the whole question of slavery. And so one of the reasons that it took some 9 years after the Battle of the Alamo for Texas to become a state was because Texas intended if it was a state to be a slave state, and there were a lot of people who weren't sure we needed another slave state in the United States. It finally did become a state in 1845, and that became one of the direct causes of the Mexican-American War. And of course, the end of the Mexican-American War led to another whole set of decisions because there were other territories, New Mexico and Utah, and the question and the question of what their status would be, and California. So California was admitted as a free state, and the interests of the other two states were sort of left up in the air a bit. But that was all part of the compromise of 1850. And another part of that compromise of 1850 was the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which in effect put the US government in the business of returning escaped slaves, or at least being responsible for the return of escaped slaves. And that became one of the most divisive pieces of legislation ever. It was a time when abolitionists fought to keep slaves who had escaped, formerly enslaved persons who had escaped to quote freedom, free, sometimes paying for them, and sometimes harboring them. And in very many ways, keeping alive a whole debate over what kind of country that this should be. One of the more interesting, and then there were many people who became, many former slaves who became quite famous as they waged battle to stay free against, even though the Fugitive Slave Act required them to be returned to their quote masters. And one of the more famous of these, at least at the time, was a woman named Margaret Garner, who came to Cincinnati, Ohio, with her husband and 4 children. They crossed the lake from Kentucky, and arrived in Cincinnati, and almost immediately were arrested by so-called slave catchers with the intent of taking them back to Kentucky. And Margaret decided that she was going to resist in the only way that she saw possible for her, which was that she was going to kill her children. She was going to keep her children from being enslaved. She killed her daughter. The slave catchers burst into the room in time to stop her from killing anyone else. And she ended up eventually being returned to her quote owner. But her case became a huge public case and a huge sort of public cause, and actually was the inspiration behind the book Beloved, which by our Supreme Court, not our Supreme Court, but by our Nobel Prize winner, who basically crafted a story around this dilemma of what personal price were people willing to pay, at this era in this time, to try to be free. That was a very tumultuous era in American history. In some ways, it's been compared to this. It was, of course, the era shortly before the Civil War, and it was the era that saw the birth of the Republican Party, which, again, something that many people have sort of forgotten. When the Republican Party, which was formed in the 1850s, in 1854 to be specific, was formed, it was derided by critics in the press and by Democrats and others as the Black Republicans. They were called the Black Republicans because they were advocating for an end of slavery. And they were met in pro-slavery quarters with a great deal of suspicion and even hostility. Their first candidate running for president was John Fremont, who was an abolitionist, basically, who wanted to see the end of slavery. And their second candidate to run for president was Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. And Abraham Lincoln's election, of course, led directly to the succession of several states and ultimately, to the Civil War. And which left the United States with some very interesting decisions. I mean, which had to do with what was the fate of these millions of people who were former slaves. As the Civil War drew to a close, General Sherman issued what was called Special Field Order number 15, which basically provided and he issued this after meeting with several Black freemen in Savannah, Georgia, and it provided for up to 40 acres of land. No mules were mentioned in the order, but it provided for up to 40 acres of land, and for some 18,000 formerly enslaved people. That order ended up being essentially overturned or rejected by Andrew Johnson, when he became president. But that era, which brought the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, which all formally ended slavery and granted equal rights and granted the vote to those freemen who had not been allowed to vote before, also ushered in the period of Reconstruction. And so again, we as a country flirted very seriously with what does Black equality look like? What does it really mean to try to create a station where former slaves and former slave owners embrace equality together? And it was a noble experiment in some ways, which lasted for until the close for basically 20 years. And then you had the election of 1876, which pitted Tilden against Rutherford Hayes, which was a contested election, which ended up with no clear majority in the Electoral College. It ended up with negotiations in Congress and with members of the Supreme Court. But ultimately what happened was that you got the Compromise of 1877. And that compromise effectively ended Reconstruction. The troops were taken out of the South, and it led to the era of the Southern Democrats, rise to power, and the Redeemers, who essentially returned the freemen to a state very close to what they had seen before. And the whole idea of equality, the whole idea of America being a true interracial democracy was abandoned. And it was abandoned until the modern civil rights era. Instead, you got Jim Crow. Instead, you got a series of policies and laws which effectively prevented Blacks from voting in the South. And you delayed by 100 years the serious consideration of making this United States one nation. And when we finally did get the modern civil rights era, and we did embrace the idea, at least theoretically, and in many ways more than theoretically, of becoming a nation of where we actually were serious about the dream of equality. We also saw a lot of pushback against that. And some of that pushback ended up resulting in a political realignment of sorts, going back to, so that the Republican Party, which began as a party that was ridiculed before its support of Blacks, to the extent that it was called that its members were called Black Republicans, decided that it needed to make a change. And from my way of thinking, you can mark that change with Barry Goldwater, who in 1961, this is even before he became a candidate for president, advised in a major party meeting to his fellow Republicans. He basically stood up and said, look, we're not going to get the Negro vote in 64 or in 68. So we ought to go, and this is a direct quote, we ought to go hunting where the ducks are. That was the beginning of the modern Republicans Party turn away from the idea of racial equality towards something else. And it's never quite turned back again. And so what we saw is a whole series of policies beginning with, of course, Goldwater, whose election failed. But Richard Nixon's, said to himself, this makes sense. He said, if we are essentially the anti-Black party, or at least or at least, and we call that the anti-violence party, or the war on crime party, and the war on drugs party, et cetera, we can put together a political majority, which was in effect the beginning of the Southern strategy, and which has sort of brought us in some ways to where we are today, where race remains a central part of politics, where the battle for racial equality is subsumed somewhat by another battle, which is the battle to keep the United States the way that it was, or the way that it used to be, Therefore, we get the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And we're sort of stuck there in some ways, and not only are we stuck there. I mean, we have because we have demographic projections, which basically show that the era of America as a white nation, as it was formerly understood, may be numbered. That at some point in the 2040s, or maybe a little bit later than that, the United States will become a majority minority nation. People are sort of very nervous about what that implies for the future. I mean, I happen to think those projections are a little bit silly. I happen to think that, as a nation, we have continually redefined what race is, and what it means to be white, and what it means to be other ethnicities as well. And that, the whatever America changes to will be an evolution into something that is not at all frightening. But again, I think that's beside the point. There are a lot of people who are very frightened of what we might become. And out of that fright has become a whole series of policies. Some of them, these sort of anti-woke policies that I referred to. But also a major effort at voter suppression. This year in January, in at least 32 states, there were introduced bills to restrict voting in various ways. We've seen an increase in the use of the gerrymandering, so much so that we have, according to an analysis by the Center for American Progress, we have 59 seats that are shifted, that from what they probably would be under a more neutral analysis because of partisan gerrymandering. We also, though, have some structural issues that which go all the way back to the Constitution. We have historically, beginning with the Constitution itself, had 2 senators from every state. We still have 2 senators from every state. Back in 1789, when the Constitution went into effect, that perhaps made some sense, because the states were not nearly as disparate in size, as they are now. The biggest state, Virginia, was then within 8 times the size of the smallest state, Delaware, 12 times if you counted the population of enslaved people there. Whereas today, California, which is the largest state, is 68 times the size of Wyoming, which is the smallest state. But we still have a representation process that favors smaller states, to the extent, if you just look at the numbers, you have 18% of the population that now effectively controls the Senate, which is not what the founding fathers intended. And the effect of that is that, in many ways, what the majority wants in this country really doesn't matter, because the majority no longer rules. And I think that's an issue that goes beyond the Senate. It goes to the Electoral College, but it also goes to money, in politics, and that's because we have a country that's also seen a major disparity in wealth, and a growing disparity. And to talk about a just society is to talk about a society that doesn't invariably favor the rich over the poor. It's to talk about a society that allows something resembling equal opportunity, and also equal access, to the levers of power and to political institutions. I'm going to close out by reading a section, from my latest book, which is called Race and Reckoning, which tackles, many of these issues. Over the centuries, the United States has moved closer to the ideal of a true democracy, where at least in theory, every voice has a right to be heard. At the same time, issues have become more complicated and more difficult to follow, and disinformation has become epidemic. We have reached a dangerous point where much of the public can't be bothered with the task of getting to the truth, and therefore puts its trust in political propaganda and conspiracy theories, while dismissing even self-evident facts. This road leads nowhere good. Perhaps, as many fear, it will lead to the end of democracy, to the end of the democracy we thought we were building. What is the antidote to this threat of willful ignorance, to the apparent inability of so many to think clearly or to distinguish blatant lies from reality? The challenge to our educational system is clear. It must become better, fast at teaching critical thinking. Unfortunately, certain politicians are applying maximum pressure to ensure that critical thinking is the last thing institutions of learning encourage. With laws aimed at prohibiting the teaching of uncomfortable ideas, they are determined to keep students as complacent as possible, even if that complacency is rooted in closed-minded thinking and ignorance. Ignorance may not be bliss, such politicians seem to assume, but is infinitely better than having young people question the ways of their elders. The challenge to the large society, perhaps, is to understand that the most serious danger to democracy lies not in our differences, but in our failure to see beyond them. A large group of Americans is brought into a very specific and odd idea of democracy, complete with a new Bill of Rights that includes the right to forego wearing face masks during an epidemic, which implies the right to spread infectious diseases, the right to buy and bear powerful military-grade arms, which implies the right to recklessly endanger the lives of ordinary citizens and school children, the right to reject duly elected leaders in deference to defeated candidates, which implies the right to ignore the will of the majority, the right to dismiss the evidence of global warming and science in general, which implies the right to kill the planet and pollute the environment, the right to lie about whomever and whatever they like without regard to any harms that doing so might cause, and the list goes on. The beauty of this new Bill of Rights is that it requires no process of ratification. It just requires a willingness to jettison the idea that rights come with responsibilities and that democracy belongs to more than the anointed few. How should a democratic leading society respond to this? There are certain obvious options. One is to submit to the tyranny of the minority and accept the consequences. Another is to attempt to compromise, profess faith in bipartisanship, and hope that the politics of ignorance is a passing fancy. Another is to refuse to concede an inch to a belligerent minority that believes its self-selected rights are the only rights that matter. We have faced similar choices before. Thanks to the experience of the framers in drafting a constitution and to the experience of the Republicans of another age and reconsidering Reconstruction, we have a pretty good sense of what it means to bend to those with no respect for the rights of others. We know that to compromise with those who are intent on perpetrating immorality is to make the ultimate deal with Satan. We have learned that meekly giving way to bullies did nothing more or less than appeasement. Our long and still ongoing fight for recognition of our common humanity, regardless of gender, skin color, or ethnicity, has also taught us that the capacity to fight vile ideas and bad behavior is infinite, even in the face of crushing odds, especially if we keep faith with the proposition, yet unproven, that the arc of democracy eventually bends towards the common good. Thank you for your attention.